Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming here this morning. My name is Tony Broccoli. I'm co-director of the Rutgers Climate Institute. And on behalf of my co-director, Robin Lashenko, who you'll hear from shortly, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2022 Rutgers Climate Symposium. We've been having these symposia here at Rutgers since 2006, and we really enjoy hosting this annual event where we try to bring people together across disciplines, from the natural and social sciences, to collaborate on this important issue of climate change. I'm a climate scientist. I study the dynamics of the climate system, and I'm in the Department of Environmental Sciences in the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences here at Rutgers. And it's my pleasure this morning to welcome Dr. Wendy Kohik from the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences, where she is Director of Research and Graduate Education, and also from the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station, part of our land grant mission here at Rutgers, where she is also Director of Research. I've worked with Wendy. We were department chairs together, and of course work with her now in her current capacity. And she has been a wonderful supporter of the Rutgers Climate Institute. So it's my pleasure to introduce her now to give you some welcoming remarks. Wendy?
Thank you, Tony, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all this morning. And I am happy to welcome you to Livingston campus. Today's symposium focuses on the intersection of climate change and biodiversity. The work many of you here today do is critical in understanding how the climate system has been changing and is projected to change. At the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences, we strive to understand just what these profound changes mean to biological diversity, not only to our terrestrial and aquatic systems, but also their cascading effects on our food systems, our health, our infrastructure, our economies, and our communities. Covenings like this provide perspective and opportunities for collaboration and further our purpose in educating students who will steward us into the future. As New Jersey's land-grant institution, we are home to the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station, with its mission to closely link research to our extension and outreach programs, to develop knowledge, and most importantly, to deliver it to society. New Jersey is biologically rich in diversity with unique ecosystems like the highlands, the pine barrens, the Delaware Bayshore, the meadowlands, and our Atlantic coastal fisheries. We know these systems are being impacted by climate change. I hope today's symposium will inspire you and provide you with new opportunities to work together to advance our collective knowledge to address the very real challenge of climate change that is impacting not only critical systems in New Jersey, but across our region and beyond. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the symposium.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Dean Kohik, for those nice welcoming comments. My name is Robin Lashenko, and as Tony mentioned, I'm the co-director of the Rutgers Climate Institute. I'm also a geographer in the School of Arts and Sciences, and my work focuses on the social and economic impacts of climate change. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce our interim dean, Dean Jim Michelli, there he is. I want to thank Jim and the School of Arts and Sciences for the continuing support that they've offered to the Rutgers Climate Institute for now getting on almost, 16 years. So thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Robin. I want to welcome you all to Rutgers University. Those of you who are not already part of Rutgers University, who've come from elsewhere, I hope you have a chance to explore this beautiful campus on this beautiful fall day. I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the School of Arts and Sciences. Climate change affects every place on Earth and every facet of society. Understanding its causes, consequences, and solutions requires scholarly collaborations that intersect society and the environment. Rutgers Climate Institute is a model for such cross-disciplinary collaborations, with more than 150 faculty affiliates from 13 schools across the university who represent the natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, arts, law, medicine, business, and engineering. Today's program embodies this transdisciplinary approach to addressing these complex issues around climate change, biodiversity, and their points of intersection. The negotiations that are taking place in Egypt this week and next on the 27th Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and similarly, those that will occur next month at the 15th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity in Montreal, rely on your critical scholarship and collective engagement. Thank you to our presenters today for sharing your work and to all of you for your participation. Let me turn it back to Robin. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks so much. Thanks for that intro, Jim, and thank you to Wendy. And so before we commence the keynote, I'll be sort of emceeing, I guess, through the keynote and the questions, et cetera, so you don't have to expect more and more, another parade of different people. But before we commence, let me just acknowledge our sponsor, Frank Sposato. Frank was an economics major, and he was a member of the Rutgers College who graduated in 1973. He generously provided a memorial endowment to the Rutgers Climate Institute, which underwrites our today's symposium. And with that, I just want to mention there's an outstanding breakfast back there. If people haven't partaken of it, please do. It's really probably one of the best breakfasts you'll get at an event at Rutgers. So let me also thank our planning committee. We had a wonderful planning committee. We have lots of people, so just bear with me. From Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources, we have Julie Lockwood, Malin Pinsky, Lena Strew, and John Wiedemann. From Environmental Sciences, Ben Littner and Mary Whalen. From Geography, Laura Schneider. From Marine and Coastal Sciences, Grace Saba and Daphne Monroe. And from Human Ecology, Pam McElway. And finally, from the Rutgers Climate Institute, Marjorie Kaplan. Thank you, everyone, for all the work on organizing this symposium. And also thank you to our volunteers who were manning or personing the stations and so forth this morning and are helping out throughout the day. So turning to our program now, we are delighted to have as our keynote this morning Dr. Patrick Gonzalez. Dr. Gonzalez is a forest ecologist and climate change scientist who comes to us from the University of California at Berkeley. Dr. Gonzalez has had a distinguished career in both government and academia. He's served as Principal Climate Change Scientist of the U.S. National Park Service. Most recently, he served as Assistant Director for Climate and Biodiversity at the White House Office of Science and Technology and Policy, and he's also served as lead author for 4 IPCC reports and has conducted field research in Africa, Latin America, and throughout the United States. Please welcome Dr. Patrick Gonzalez.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for your interest. On a Christmas morning, 35 years ago, I woke up on the floor of Yosemite Valley, and stepping out of my tent was like stepping into an Ansel Adams photograph. The brilliant white of the snow, the silver of the granite walls, and the black canopy of the ponderosa pines. Yet, published scientific research using data from Yosemite has shown that all those aspects of that scene have changed in 35 years. Snowpack has reduced 10%. Wildfire in the region has doubled over natural levels, and climate change has shifted plants and animals upslope in Yosemite National Park. Impacts such as these have damaged ecological integrity around the world. Yet, recent progress on carbon solutions in the United States and globally offer us hope for the future. And so today, I'm going to cover these issues in these 5 sections. And I gratefully acknowledge the collaboration and work of my colleagues on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Today, I'm going to review the fundamental science of climate change and biodiversity and present a lot of the newest results from our report published this year. The human cause of climate change is important because it points us to the solutions. Cars, power plants, deforestation, and other human sources pump nearly 11 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere every year. But forests, oceans, and soils only naturally can remove 6 billion tons. So the 5 billion tons remaining goes up into the atmosphere, and it's that fundamental imbalance that causes climate change. Nearly all of the ecosystem carbon emissions comes from tropical deforestation, such as this burning forest in the Brazilian Amazon. Consequently, carbon dioxide has shot up to its highest level in 2 million years. The horizontal axis here starts at 2021 and goes back 3 million years. And that straight line at the end here is all of human history from the Industrial Revolution to today. And consequently, temperature has increased to its highest, the global average surface temperature has increased to its highest level in 120,000 years. And IPCC has assessed the research on the different potential causes of the heating, and we see that the observed heating from the Global Weather Station Network matches the net effect of human activities, and natural sources are extremely small. Human activities are causing climate change. The main impact of this, of course, has been an increase of 1.1 degrees Celsius global average since the pre-industrial era. But we see in very high latitudes and also in very high latitudes in the Arctic and Antarctica, extremely high, over 3 times the global average rate. Zooming in on the United States, colleagues and I published the first analysis at 800 spatial resolution of all the 50 states and overseas territories in the United States. And the darkest reds here are an increase of 2.5 degrees Celsius per century. And we see those are occurring at high latitudes. And in the desert southwest, we have an anomalous area in the southeast of non-statistically significant change in temperature. But overall, the United States, of course, has shown increase in temperature. The U.S. national parks have been exposed to twice the heating of the United States as a whole. And that's because national parks are sited in extreme environments at high elevation, in the very far north, and in the desert southwest. This is a map similar for total annual precipitation. Darkest blues are an increase of 50% in a century, and darkest browns are a decrease of 50%. And of course, climate change is an input of energy into the atmospheric system, which translates into more convection and more precipitation. So 4/5 of the area is blue here, an increase in precipitation. But it's redistributing the energy in a way that we've had a drought in the southwestern US since 2000, and also decreases in eastern Alaska. I'm going to show you now a series of examples of impacts of what we've just seen in the changes in climate, but impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem integrity. Each of the examples has gone through these two scientific procedures: detection, a change that's statistically significantly different from natural variation, and attribution, which is looking at all the different potential causal factors and determining the relative weight of anthropogenic climate change. And so all the examples I show you will have gone through these two procedures. And most seriously and saddening has been the deaths of thousands of people that we know of in heat waves around the world. And just as serious and saddening has been the extinction of 2 animal species, including the golden toad from Monteverde cloud forest in Costa Rica, where climate change has lifted the cloud deck, which is essential for maintaining the moisture and maintaining resistance to the chytrid fungus. The second species that we have sadly lost is this small animal from Australia, where sea level rise has overtopped this island so many times that it has inundated its habitat. Okay, this is Muir Glacier in Glacier Bay National Park in Alaska. Keep your eye on the top of Muir Glacier here, 1941, against that mountain. 63 years later, we've lost here at its lowest reaches over 600 meters of ice, the equivalent of the height of one World Trade Center. So this is 1941, and this is 2004. It's lost, it's even retracted even more since then. Anthropogenic climate change has melted 16% of glacial ice globally, and the rate of melt is accelerating. In Bandelier National Monument in New Mexico and across the southwestern US, climate change has caused the most severe drought since the 1500s. And climate change intensifies the heat that drives wildfire and has lengthened the fire season up to 2 months in parts of the world, including in Tahoe National Forest, California, the site of this incredible fire tornado in 2020. Now, wildfire is natural and necessary in many temperate forest ecosystems. Actually, many temperate and tropical forest ecosystems, but excessive fire, of course, damages ecological integrity and kills people. The intensification of the heat and aridity of anthropogenic climate change has doubled wildfire across the western United States above natural levels, including here the Rim Fire, which burned up into Yosemite National Park. Here we see from 1985 to 2015, the yellow is the wildfires that would have occurred without climate change, and this is the orange is the additional doubling over that. Burned area has actually increased 1,000% in the western United States since 1985. Wildfire has been increasing in different regions around the world, but in IPCC we assessed the attribution, and a lot of different factors drive wildfire. We've seen tropical deforestation in North America and in Europe. We have a buildup of unnatural accumulation of fuel in the forests because of this unnatural suppression of wildfire. So this map, you have circles that are 3 colors, red, orange. It's orange on my computer, and yellow. The colors here are a little different. And the red areas here, as we've seen, the western United States, the increase in wildfire has been detected and attributed to anthropogenic climate change. But elsewhere around the world, actually, intentional deforestation, agricultural intensification, and other factors, including interannual climate variability like El Nino, which is a natural cycle, those non-climate change factors have exerted a greater influence than climate change in many parts of the world. So here we see a very good case of this exacerbation of existing stresses and existing damages to ecosystems by climate change. So it's not everything is just climate change. It's climate change and deforestation, climate change and land cover change. One of the follow-on impacts is a loss of carbon. Colleagues and I analyzed for the first time wall-to-wall carbon changes in California ecosystems, and up until our work, the state wasn't sure of the carbon balance of ecosystems, but our work showed actually that ecosystems have been losing carbon in California, and mainly because of wildfire. 2/3 of the ecosystem carbon emissions came from the 6% of the land that burned, these brown patches. Similarly, the combination of tropical deforestation in the Amazon and climate change have caused the Amazon to become a net emitter of carbon to the atmosphere. In Rocky Mountain National Park and across the western United States, climate change has doubled tree mortality from 3 causes: drought, wildfire, and bark beetle infestations, which has hit these lodgepole pines. And in the African Sahel, climate change has killed 1 out of every 5 adult trees in this area, and caused the local disappearance of 1 out of every 3 tree and shrub species. And this is in an area that has experienced the most severe drought in the global weather station record. That's from my field research. Field research in Yosemite National Park has shown that climate change has shifted subalpine forest upslope into formerly treeless meadows. And this has occurred also in Fiordland National Park in New Zealand, where temperate broadleaf forest has shifted up into subalpine shrubland. And you can see very clearly the elevational differentiation of vegetation there. So those are just 2 cases of shifts of vegetation at the biome level that anthropogenic climate change has caused. So these shifts have occurred in boreal, temperate, and tropical ecosystems. This is from the last IPCC report, an assessment that I did. We've seen 2 species have gone completely extinct. Over 400 species have experienced local population disappearances due to anthropogenic climate change, including the pika from 10 sites in the Great Basin in Nevada and Oregon, where climate change has shifted its suitable climate off the top of mountains. And in the southwestern US, climate change has caused a 40% decrease in bird species richness due to the increasing aridity. In Peru, climate change has shifted the habitat off the top of a mountain of the white-eared solitaire and 4 other species and caused them to be extirpated. Across the southwestern U.S., climate change has reduced butterfly species richness up to half, including this Fritillary coronus. And climate change has caused a decrease of bumblebee species richness up to 1/3 across North America and Europe. Very important pollinators. We depend on them for our food. Trees depend on them for pollination and reproduction. In Africa, climate change has caused the waters of Lake Tanganyika have increased them to its highest level in 1,500 years, and that has decreased fish abundance, and of course people depend on this lake for their livelihoods. Globally, anthropogenic climate change has increased sea level about 20 centimeters. Here in this national park in the heart of Washington, D.C., climate change has actually increased sea level up to about halfway up your knee, 30 centimeters. "90% of the energy, the increased energy of climate change goes into the oceans. And so ocean temperatures have increased at 0.9 degrees Celsius in the past century, including here in Channel Islands National Park in California. The most serious effect of this has been the bleaching of mainly tropical corals, because corals, of course, are symbiosis of living parts and inorganic parts, and not a symbiosis, but they're a cohabitation of the living parts in the inorganic part, and the hot water of climate change makes the corals expel the living part, and all we're left with is the calcareous skeleton. Climate change has acidified ocean waters because carbon dioxide, of course, naturally dissolves in water. The pH of natural rainwater is about 5.6 consequently. But the more atmospheric carbon dioxide we have, the more dissolves and forms a weak carbonic acid. And so Pacific Ocean waters have acidified up to 40%, including here in Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument in Hawaii. And this ocean acidification is corroding corals and shellfish in many locations around the world. Okay, that was a lot of bad news, I know. We're going to get the good news here with the carbon solutions. But before that, we have even, regrettably, even more bad news because of the carbon paths on which we are right now. So the IPCC has developed emission scenarios, and these are the 6 emission scenarios from the latest assessment. So projecting climate change is not like predicting the weather. Climate change is a function of human behavior, and so the scenarios are storylines of the future of population, energy, economic activity, and on this graph, we have the weather station record here in black and the different pathways that we can take here. The worst case in red and the best case meeting the Paris Agreement in blue. Where do you think we are? Do we have optimists or pessimists in the room? Just real Pardon? Okay, we are between 4.5, and we're between the orange and the red here, about right here, right now. So it could be worse, but it could. We're going to see that we need to make progress. In the latest IPCC report, we identified 5 key risks to ecological integrity, and these burning embers graphs show the level of risk versus as a function of temperature increase above the pre-industrial level. And we have four colors here, and the transition from white to yellow is the detection and attribution, when you can start detecting and attributing to anthropogenic climate change one of these impacts. The transition from yellow to red is when it goes from moderate to high, and then to very high, and that's where we see the severe impacts on ecosystems. And so it was previous versions of this burning embers from the 2014 IPCC report that provided the scientific foundation for international policy on climate change. The Paris Agreement goal of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius came from the IPCC work on thresholds of ecological and socioeconomic risks. So the gray bar is the average from 2011 to 2020. And so we're right here, right now. So we're edging up into the areas of more severe risks. I'm going to show you a lot of the research looks at the worst case. I'm going to go through a lot of the different worst case scenarios to illustrate the potential impacts on ecological integrity. And of course, for biodiversity, species extinction is the most serious potential impact. And at 4 degrees, species extinctions could be 30% greater than all the extinctions in all of human history for the past 12,000 years. And that's just in the space of potentially 1 century, including the polar bear. Of course, the polar bear and the roofer red knot, just across the bay from New Jersey here in Delaware Seashore State Park. But more seriously, the roofer red knot and 30 other species are listed in the U.S. Endangered Species Act as threatened because of anthropogenic climate change, in addition to other factors. 20 of these are actually coral species. One of those is the emperor penguin in Antarctica, which at over 4 degrees heating could decline by over 90%. Poor penguin. Monarch butterflies, which are threatened in North America by neonicotinoids and overuse of pesticides, but they're threatened in their home in Mexico with upslope shifting of Abies religiosa, oyamel fir. And the green area is the area of the potential habitat today, and the red is the potential habitat under the worst case, so a contraction and upslope shift of its habitat. In Madagascar, the radiated tortoise is threatened, both by climate change and by local hunting, and of course, as a cold-blooded animal, it's particularly susceptible to environmental conditions. In the Virgin Islands and around tropical reefs around the world, ocean acidification could cause net dissolving by 2100 under the highest emission scenario. Those are the corals, but of course, a lot of people live at or near sea level, including here in Kiribati in the South Pacific, and at 4 degrees. Okay, so up to now, sea level has been to about here. At 4 degrees, it would be up to here. And that's just a transient solution, right? That's at the end of the century where a lot of the research ends. But that doesn't mean it peaks at the end of the century. It could go even higher, of course. Biome shifts. Biomes are the highest level of ecological organization. And these 13 biomes here, this is the distribution under current climate with a 1961-1990 baseline. And so you see here the latitudinal bands of vegetation. Under climate change, under the worst case, okay, so this is today, and this is worst case, and you see potential shifts of hundreds of kilometers of biomes. In this most recent IPCC report, found that the different modeling results show 5 to 50% of terrestrial land area at risk of these biome shifts. And tropical dry forests, and we're going to hear more about those, are actually one of the most highly threatened biomes, like there in Kanha National Park in India. Climate change under high emission increases tree mortality risks. This is the third of those burning embers. First we had loss of biodiversity, then we had biome shifts, and now we're at the middle ember, tree mortality. And under the highest emissions, tree mortality could increase up to half in the western United States, including here in Yosemite National Park. Some individual species at risk: the coast redwood, the tallest living beings on Earth, at risk because of a reduction of fog. They depend on fog for their moisture inputs. Also, bristlecone pine, the oldest living beings on Earth, at risk of bark beetle infestations. Bark beetles are native and they're natural, but of course climate change is allowing them to survive the winter, have a second brood, move upward in elevation. Recent research shows that adjacent other pine species are the hosts for the bark beetle that can jump onto the bristlecone pine very sadly, which has survived millennia. In Joshua Tree National Park, climate change threatens the reason for the establishment of the park, the Joshua Tree at highest emissions. Very few spots of suitable climate are left in the national park. A few refugia, or potentially stable areas because of local conditions, but those are very few, almost all the area, because Joshua Tree here is at the southern end of its historical range. So this is not a potential extinction, it's a potential shifting north out of the national park. And wildfire, again, even though it's natural and necessary, it's increasing, and at the highest emission, at 4 degrees, climate change could increase burned area 50 to 70%. I'm sorry, 50 to 70%. Including here in the Amazon again, the combination of climate change and active deforestation. That could double burned area in the Amazon. The last burning ember was carbon loss. And that potential doubling of burned area in the Amazon, both from climate change and active deforestation, could convert up to half of the rainforest to grassland under the most extreme scenarios. And that would be 1 to 3 years of our current annual carbon emissions up into the atmosphere. And of course, that causes a self-reinforcing feedback. Climate change causes the wildfire and tree mortality, which releases carbon, which exacerbates climate change, which exacerbates the tree mortality again, self-reinforcing feedback. The stakes for Arctic tundra and permafrost are even greater because at 4 degrees, the fires and the thawing of the permafrost could release up to 15 years, the equivalent of 15 years of global carbon emissions, including like this tundra fire in Noatak National Preserve in Alaska. Okay. Adaptation is an adjustment of biodiversity conservation measures, natural resource management measures to respond to climate change. And one of the options that we have is to prioritize those refugia, those potentially stable areas. And Joshua Tree is doing exactly that. They use that published research from UC Riverside, which identified potential refuge in the park, and they prioritize those. Now, a lot of protected area management for biodiversity is about prioritization because we don't have enough funds and staff for all of the strict protection, 100% of all the areas. So we need to focus in and prioritize on certain areas. So the park has prioritized these areas to defend them against wildfire, which is not natural in this ecosystem, and for invasive species removal, and for long-term monitoring. We're going to hear a lot more about that from Tony. Another adaptation measure would be upgrading U.S. policies from suppression of all fires, including natural fires, to restoration of natural fire through prescribed burning and allowing natural fires, naturally ignited fires, to burn. That's called managed wildland fire. And actually, I worked on this during the past year with the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy because our past national wildland fire policy did not include climate change. Our national wildland fire policy did not include climate change, and so a year of work, and we've now put climate change into national wildfire policy. Working landscapes, agricultural, forestry, plantation, other working landscapes form an essential link in the conservation landscape. So agroforestry, like here, this cacao agroforestry in Costa Rica, provides as much habitat, nearly as much habitat for birds as adjacent intact forest. In the Sahel, this farmer that I worked with in Yamansek in Senegal, Bara Diop, this is his field where he has used natural regeneration to double or triple the density of trees in his field. So he selected naturally germinating trees, pruned them and protected them from livestock, and raised them. And we can see here natural regeneration of native tree cover, including, this is Ziziphus jujubes. The 30 by 30 goal is set to become our international policy for biodiversity conservation under the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, and it's a target to conserve 30% of the world's lands and waters by 2030. It is U.S. national policy, and it's actually a policy of the state of California. And one potential policy innovation for this, where we could double the area under U.S. federal protection by upgrading the conservation management, particularly of national forests and Bureau of Land Management lands, which are run for livestock. Okay, so as I said before, we've seen a lot of bad news, but now we're going to see a little more bad news, then we're going to see good news. Because the IPCC has shown that with undercurrent emissions, we could hit the 1.5 degree mark by about 2032 and hit the 2 degree mark by about 2050. We have about 120 gigatons left. An update of this is 120 gigatons is our carbon budget remaining for the 1.5 degrees. And so to limit the heating to 1.5 degrees requires us to cut in half our emissions by 2050 and go to net zero, cut in half our emissions by 2030, and go to net zero by 2050. And so that's a cut of emissions about 4 to 6% per year. Okay, so part of the good news is that under the Framework Convention on UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and of course the Conference of the Parties is meeting this week, countries have pledged and set net zero goals that would get us to 1.8 degrees, this blue line right here, that would get us to 1.8 degrees. The bad news is that the policies that have been enacted and that are under implementation only get us to 2.8. So we're trying to close that gap between the ambition and the actuality right here. Okay, so one of the major options that's essential to get to net zero is to halt tropical deforestation, and we could cut emissions 10%, and this is through the UN, the International Policy of Reduced Emissions from Deforestation and Degradation, REDD, and rainforests like here in Gabon, the Congo rainforest. And field experience and published research show that national parks are the most effective, national parks and protected areas are the most effective means to stop tropical deforestation. And this is the Parque Nacional Yanachaga-Quimien in Peru, the Peruvian Amazon, and national parks from 2000 to 2012 actually reduced deforestation in those areas by over 70%. And this is good news, finally. One great example in Indonesia, one policy example, they put a moratorium on concessions for oil palm plantations and for timber harvesting, and reduced deforestation substantially, reduced emissions substantially. This is how it looked like before the ban in 2011. Primary rainforest here, burning, and palm oil plantations. A lot of that has been stopped. If U.S. passengers, cars, and light trucks were their own country, they would be the 8th worst carbon polluter in the world. Cars and U.S. cars and trucks would be the 8th worst carbon polluter in the world, more than Iran, more than all the emissions from Canada, more than all the emissions from Germany. So this is an area where you can take individual, personal, meaningful action on climate change by walking, riding your bike, taking public transit. You can cut your personal carbon emissions up to 99%. And I live a car-free life. I encourage you all to also. But if you can't, park your car for 1 out of 7 days. If everybody does that in the United States who owns a car, we cut our emissions 42 million tons of carbon a year. That's 3 times all of the emissions from the Republic of Ireland. Just 1 day a week, 3 times the emissions of all of Ireland. So go car-free or just start off 1 day a week. Another area where you can take personal, individual, meaningful action on climate change is by adopting a plant-rich, meat-free diet, because cattle, of course, produce a lot of methane in their guts, and the production of their feed also produces a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So global adoption of a plant-rich, meat-free diet could reduce global greenhouse gas emissions 40%. And now we're coming to some really good news, because we are showing progress. A lot of those actions that I just went through are being implemented. In California, we've cut our emissions 11% since 2000, and that's at the same time that population increased 17%. So population increased 17%, but emissions went down 11%, and that's because of energy efficiency, renewable energy like this solar array on a roof on Lassen Volcanic National Park, public transit, energy efficiency, emissions per person during that time went down 24%. The United States, renewable energy exceeded coal for the first time in 2019, for the first time since the 1880s. And it continues to go up, and coal continues to go down. So that's more good news. Internationally, since 2000, the countries of the world have installed solar, wind, and other renewables equivalent to 6,500 coal-fired power plants, quadrupling capacity globally. In conclusion, the IPCC has shown that those actions, energy efficiency, renewable energy, halting deforestation, the existing actions and behaviors are enough that the 1.5 to 2 degree goal is attainable with concerted global action at all levels: individuals, governments, corporations. We see here the net global emissions, and we see here the temperature increase, and we see here the potential futures that we can still achieve with concerted global action. And individual action is an extremely important part of this. It's essential. Billions and billions of small, unsustainable actions cause the problem of climate change. So billions and billions of sustainable actions, however small, can help solve it. Thank you. Great. So questions for how many minutes? Well, I'm sorry. Our MC is coming back.
So we're just going to do questions for about 15 minutes. We're going to break at 10:15. And can we ask the folks with questions to please come up to the microphone here so that everyone can hear the questions, if that's okay? And we have sort of a tradition of prioritizing, or at least organizing the questions so that students can students ask the questions first, and then we sort of proceed after that. So please come on up to the, I saw a bunch of hands, so please come on up.
All right. Oop. Is this on? Hello? Oh. Hi. So I guess a lot of things I've read about deforestation specifically in the Northeast and New Jersey have a lot to do with deer overpopulation, which is like a really big, human-caused problem. I'm wondering if we can possibly help restore the forests by also addressing deer management as a factor in reforesting areas that have been basically browsed down to just nothing.
This morning I just walked through Kilmer Woods where they're engaged in deer management, which I think is a euphemism for hunting, killing the deer. Overpopulation, of course, because their natural predators have been removed. The white-tailed deer population has exploded throughout the eastern and midwestern United States. And as you said, you see the browse line, the height of where a deer can get up on its hooves. Historically, the forests in the Northeast have actually rebounded and accumulated carbon in the colonial era. A lot of the forests were cleared for agriculture, and with the abandonment of agriculture, actually the carbon density of a lot of the eastern woodlands increased. Currently, I'm not sure of what the impact of reducing the deer population would be on the total standing biomass. However, I think what's essential is keeping the old growth and promoting the growth of older, serial, larger trees. And if and so the first natural resource management objective should be to conserve the oldest forests there. There are areas where removing the deer would certainly increase carbon because of regeneration of oaks and other native tree species. But that needs to be balanced with what the natural density and carrying capacity of the forest would be. But so those are some thoughts on that. I think right now the carbon has been restored since the colonial times, and the deer management might have an increasing impact on that, but it needs to be balanced. Okay.
Hi. Thanks for the great talk. That was super interesting. I thought the sort of last part of the talk about individual actions was like super important and just something that I think is easily overlooked by lots of people, and lots of people feel like their individual actions don't matter. And I'm pretty interested in, so for example, one of the examples you gave was like walkability, right? And like living a car-free life can be extremely beneficial both for like public health and for individual reasons, but also for the broader fight against climate change. But of course, a lot of that is structural, right? And like many places like exist where people are unable to reduce their car usage as much as they'd like to, or there's not infrastructure in place. And so I'm curious, like, what you see as beyond just making individual choices about how you transport yourself from day to day. For example, what are other things that individuals can do, or what do you see as like effective pathways to either promoting like top-down promotion of this behavior, right? So like whether that's, voting in officials or voting in elected officials who, work towards more sustainable land use and transit infrastructure, or whether there are pathways for mobilizing like large groups to sort of see these issues. I'm just curious like what your thoughts are on sort of other individual actions beyond just literally changing our behaviors in what we do in our day-to-day lives that you think are effective.
So policies policies such as the Inflation Reduction Act that this administration has enacted that invest in public transit and are shifting investment from roads and car-centered development to public transit. That's an important policy to support with your vote and perhaps with your research that illustrates the health, environmental, and climate change benefits of public transit and other transportation options. I emphasize the individual action because it's meaningful action that each of us can take. Of course, with your vote, through your research, you can influence policy. I don't think the governor or the president are here right now, and so I'm addressing you where you can have individual impact or potential impact of your research, science providing the foundation for policy. I emphasize individual actions because the United States is responsible for approximately 20% of historical cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. And our per capita emissions are currently 4.8 tons per person per year. That's compared to a global average of 1.8. So the US, 4.8, the global average, 1.8. For comparison, France is 1.4. So that shows that we can live a comfortable, healthy, sustainable lifestyle and still reduce our carbon emissions to a level where we protect the earth, which is our responsibility, our special responsibility in the United States because of our disproportionate historical impact. Thanks. Okay.
You said that like humans released a certain amount of carbon into the air, and then a certain amount of carbon could, like a less amount of carbon is what like the ground can sequester. I was just wondering, is that the amount that can be sequestered, is being sequestered currently, or could potentially be sequestered, like if you used agroforestry that increased the amount?
Oh no, that was the actual carbon budget that I showed you from those were the averages from 2011 to 2020. So those were the current estimates, and they were basically about 10.6 billion tons of emissions, and then about 6 billion tons of natural sequestration through photosynthesis in above ground vegetation, below ground vegetation, and in oceans. Natural climate solutions, which is such as reforestation. Actually, I had a big natural climate solution, which is halting deforestation, right? That could get us 10% of global emissions, reduce global emissions by 10%. But reforestation, afforestation, agroforestry, which is another natural climate solution, all of those could sequester varying amounts, maybe as much as halting tropical deforestation. The thing with halting tropical deforestation is it's immediate, and we have actually some proven actions such as protected areas. I showed you moratoriums on palm oil plantations, on timber plantations, indigenous fire brigades in the Amazon, reducing fires. So those are some of the other natural carbon solutions. What I was talking about were the actual emissions.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Mim. I'm from Rutgers University. Thank you very much for your nice presentation. It was so good. So my question is pretty simple. So these days we are hearing a lot about stratospheric aerosol injections. So my question is, do you think that this will work well on retaining biodiversity and ecosystem? Like, what's your thoughts on that?
Okay. You're talking about geoengineering,
Yeah, right.
stratospheric injections. That's quite an extreme geoengineering intervention. And my assessment, my individual assessment of our options is that we have a lot of existing behaviors and technologies that we don't need to resort to extreme interventions in the global biogeochemistry to attain our targets. There's a lot of unknown environmental impacts from a lot of those geoengineering. However, I know probably at Rutgers there's a lot of research on that. There's a lot of intense research around the world going on that. I tend to emphasize the natural climate solutions and actually the actions that we can take now without resorting to some of the more extreme measures.
Yeah, you're right. But my question is we have been trying for the other solutions for like so many years, but is it really working? Like, why is it necessary to take geoengineering if the other options were already working? Then
well, they are being developed in parallel with these actions. We are actually making progress. I said the current policies and implementation would get us to 2.8 degrees. That used to be like 3.7 degrees. We've actually been bending the curve down, which is part of the good news that I was saying. You're correct that we haven't attained our goals yet. And all the options are being developed in parallel.
yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I'm from Montclair State, and I was really interested in the slide that you had up about the 30 by 30. Like you mentioned that like the U.S. is enacting that like those policies like currently like as of this year.
Yes, President Biden established this as the 30 by 30 as a goal in an executive order in January 2021. So it's a U.S. target. Oh, there it is, Executive Order 14008. And the state of California has also established that. And the United Nations is set to adopt it officially at the next conference of the parties.
Okay. Are there other countries around the world that are like, thinking of enacting the 30 by 30?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And if you go to the website of the Convention on Biological Diversity, you'll see the submissions of a lot of the different parties to the convention. The United States, by the way, has not ratified the convention yet. We've signed but not ratified. So there's an action that you can take that's more broad, is encouraging ratification. But anyway, there's a lot of other countries that are working on 30 by 30.
All right, thank you.
And of course, we highlight Costa Rica, Madagascar. Next question, if somebody has a question. I was just following up on that. Costa Rica, Madagascar, some well-known countries have much more protected area. Yep.
Yeah, thank you again for your talk.
Thanks.
My name's Hansen, and I'm a graduate student. My question is, are incentive mechanisms necessary for a lot of the developing nations in this world to actually preserved sort of like their rainforests. That's two examples, right? Indonesia recently launched sort of like a biofuel policy program that's going to involve the creation of a lot of more palm oil plantations in order to shore up their energy security. And then as another example, like Brazil is also really clearing their rainforest for like economic purposes. While we recognize clear benefits to like preserving much of these like rainforests and whatnot, if like, do developed countries still need to provide some sort of like actively like provide incentives for these developing countries to also actually like preserve these habitats, given that there have been a slate of like policies that kind of go against that?
Climate change and biodiversity solutions need to be economically viable. Absolutely. Indonesia is a really good example. This jurisdictional this jurisdictional reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation program, financed by the Green Climate Fund, which was created by the Paris Agreement. So the government of Norway pledged a certain amount of funding to Indonesia if it demonstrated that it reduced deforestation 5 years in a row, scientifically verified. And it did. And it's one of the few countries that have been awarded this jurisdictional red financing by the Green Carbon Fund. And unlike previous economic incentives, which were project by project base, where a project would project the carbon savings, a little project would project its carbon savings into the future, and then sell those credits, what it thought it might conserve in the future. These quantify the carbon that has already been saved, all right, been demonstrated, and instead of like the old small projects, the money would go to an oil company. You would sell the credits. You would sell these future credits. And it would go to an oil company, or it would go to a fossil fuel company to try and offset their fossil fuel emissions. Instead, this funding goes back into the country to build up the forestry and biodiversity conservation capacities of the country. So the financial incentive is actually an attempt to build up the local capacity to do this. Brazil, just briefly, is a special case because they really successfully reduced deforestation under President Lula. And it was just this most past administration that again favored deforestation, favored the interests that were logging and cutting the rainforest. So we're hopeful with the return of a science, an administration in Brazil that respects science. Much like in the U.S., we returned an administration that respects science. We'll hope for progress on halting tropical deforestation there.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more in-person question, and then we actually have one question coming online, so please.
Okay.
I'm not really sure of the numbers in terms of what deforestation goes towards, and I know that deforestation could be reduced with like less livestock and, like you said, palm oil, but how much of the deforestation is due to harvesting the wood for like more houses? Like the population is increasing, as we know, so I feel like houses and infrastructure need to keep up with that. So if we're reducing deforestation, is there a replacement material that housing or other buildings are going to be made of?
The causes of deforestation vary widely around the world, and in Central Africa, for example, it's mainly small farmers clearing small patches, except in Gabon. There's a lot of timber harvesting in the Amazon Some of it's for timber harvesting, but most of it's for clearing, for livestock farming, and for soybeans. So in those areas where it is timber harvesting, one of the actions has been to trace the supply chain and to favor only certified woods that are raised in plantations. But you're talking about substitution, which there are now innovative wood products that are made from wood waste that can increasingly be used. Cement is not a good option because cement production produces a lot of carbon dioxide on its own. Thanks. So we have one question online.
Can you hear me okay, Pat? Okay, Patrick, thank you. So this question asks, how would you suggest we find the balance between carbon storage and biodiversity where promoting growth of older trees for carbon storage throughout the state will likely reduce diversity and adaptive capacity of those forests to future climate conditions, as well as increase the risk of extirpation of endangered wildlife?
She said a state, or he or she?
Yeah, yes.
Which state?
Probably New Jersey, but I guess it could be,
okay,
other places.
Okay, of course we need a mosaic of habitats of different structure, and certainly I wouldn't promote carbon sequestration at the expense of a diversity of habitat types, of grassland, woodland, and even within a forest you need patches. And so we can have carbon sequestration. We can have carbon storage and biodiversity conservation at the same time. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was really an outstanding session, Dr. Gonzalez. So now we are going to shift into a break for about 30 minutes. We're going to reconvene at 10:45. And when we do so, Julie Lockwood will be taking over, and she'll be moderating our plenary panel. So please enjoy, as I said, the tasty food and the break and the company.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I will take that natural break in the noise to go ahead and break in and not have to resort to my teacher voice to get you guys to settle down. So welcome back to the session. My name is Julie Lockwood. I'm the interim director of the Institute of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. I'm also a professor in ecology, evolution, and natural resources within the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences. The fact that I can reel that off means that I've been at Rutgers way too long, right? So for the next piece of the formal part of today, we're going to have a panel session, and we have 4 really outstanding researchers from across the U.S. who are going to come in, who are going to talk for a few minutes each. And then at the end of that, we're going to ask the 4 of them and Patrick to come back up, and we'll have a panel session where I will start us off with a few questions, but I think we'll have a lot of interest both online and from in the room to ask questions of the panel, and we'll spend a good chunk of time talking about that. Our last panel speaker will be on Zoom, so we'll have a moment then of transition for that as well. So I also want to acknowledge the fact that we have a lot of different folks from the region, including from Temple and Princeton and Montclair, and just want to welcome you guys again and hope that you're getting something out of our presentations today, and also to invite you to continue to engage with the Rutgers Climate Institute and our efforts here, both in terms of biodiversity conservation and in terms of climate change science. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first panel speaker, who is Toni Lynn Morelli, who I had the pleasure of seeing do a talk at the Ecological Society of America meetings this past summer. It was a fantastic talk circling around some of these ideas, but I'm very happy to have Toni here. She is an employee of the USGS and also an adjunct professor at UMass Amherst, working with the Northeast Climate Adaptation Center. So Toni, come on up, and we're looking forward to hearing your talk.
Hey everybody, I'm so happy to be here. I'm Tony Lynn Morelli. I am, as Julie said, with the U.S. Geological Survey at the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. And I also am adjunct at University of Massachusetts, where I have a big lab. If you don't know, we are sitting in the Northeast Cask region, and this is a really great resource for all of you, either to kind of tap into the climate science work we've done, to share your climate science with our network, and potentially to apply for funding as well. So something to be aware of either as faculty, researchers, or students. And I have a big lab at UMass, and I'll be highlighting some of the work of my students today. And David Ferris here is my new PhD student, and he's right there in the audience. You can talk to him about his work. I'm very lucky to have gone after Dr. Gonzalez. He set up well the work that has been done on climate change and on climate adaptation, and also a lot of the very scary things that are happening. Here is just a summary slide from the National Climate Assessment. That's a great resource for thinking about kind of getting a summary of what is known in the, about climate change impacts in the US. So you can see here some of the changes, of course, are increasing temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, loss of sea ice, changing species distributions. We can think about all of those impacts from the perspective of climate change and also its interactions with non-climate stressors, something I'll be talking about today, and how these stressors can affect biodiversity, as we just heard about, and terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, which then can reduce ecosystem services and ultimately have an impact on human well-being. And I live and work in this space thinking about how we can create a bigger blue buffer of climate adaptation and also looking at species adaptive capacity in order to reduce those negative impacts on these things at the bottom that we care about. You already heard a definition of climate adaptation. You can see here a depiction of one way to think about the options of climate adaptation. So we can think about on one end of the spectrum is resistance. So we can take actions designed to maintain the kind of current system, species, function, composition, all the way to the other side in which we think about transformation, where you're facilitating or driving the transition of species composition, thinking about, for example, here in the Northeast, southerly species coming up and changing that composition. This also is more recently being thought of in National Park Service and elsewhere as the kind of resist, accept, direct framework. So that's something rad that you might have heard of. I'm going to be talking from the two examples. One is thinking about this in the context of an invasive species. So here is a picture of how we can think about how climate change and invasive species are interacting and kind of exacerbating each other's effects. We can see as we have longer growing seasons, then we might have invasives emerging earlier and staying longer. Climate extremes are creating disturbances in the habitat and offering new opportunities for invasion. We have species shifting, including invasives, new pathways as sea ice melts for introduction, and then herbicides are becoming less effective and invasives are becoming more competitive. So kind of across the board, there's ways in which climate change is making things worse. We know that this is a problem, maybe in our backyards or the places we like to spend time, and also the natural resource managers do too. So these are just two quick surveys showing that the invasive species management is considered the #1 priority for public land managers across the country, thinking about concerns about invasive species. And we also know there's a lot of resources going to research invasive species, invasion ecology, but it's not quite matched with what the managers and practitioners are saying they need. So that's what's shown here by Virginia Matzek and colleagues. On the right, these bars are showing research done that wasn't quite asked for by the managers, or more than was asked for, And on the other side, what was kind of missing that the managers said they needed. This is a look over the literature in the basic research. But, okay, so that's just basic research. But if you look at applied research, you see those bars still don't match. Okay, I did change this axis, so it got a little bit better. But we still see a mismatch between what is being asked for from the ground and what the researchers are providing. In response to these kinds of issues and this giant problem about climate change, we are proposing this framework of translational ecology. And translational ecology is an intentional process by which ecologists, stakeholders, decision makers come together, work collaboratively to develop scientific research via joint consideration of the sociological, ecological, and political context of an environmental problem to result in improved decision making. You can see here, and Marjorie wants to turn the lights off, I think. You can see here, on one side is research and the other side is practice. So a lot of us in the room are on this side. We're at universities or science agencies, and we're thinking about how to produce data, basic science and theory. Eventually, we work in forecasts. And over here are our practitioner partners, land management agencies, NGOs, who are thinking about adaptive management and ecosystem management, and they maybe get their information through web portals and mapping tools, and they work in conservation planning and decision support. And the idea with translational ecology is to bring these disparate peoples together on this foundation of collaboration and trust to produce actionable science and improve decision making. We have a nice little flower to show our principles at this. We think the principles and goals of translational ecology are collaboration, engagement, commitment, communication, good process, and a decision context. We have a whole special issue on this in Frontiers in Ecology and Environment, if it's of interest. I wanted to tell you about what we did to take this idea into invasion ecology, and so this is our translational invasion ecology framework. And it talks about how it kind of shows steps, how you can start with a problem or you can start with your stakeholder group. And you then work together, so blue is practice, red is research, and then boundary spanners are in purple. And you can kind of work together, you meet, you discuss, you go out into your different ways, you do the things you do on your computers or out implementing the results, and then you come back together again. And it's this iterative process, going out and back and out and back. Ultimately, so that you each get the outcomes and outputs that work with your different incentive structure, like your needs at work. We've done this work in the context of translational invasion ecology as the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network, or RISC. We started about 6 years ago, founded by myself, Bethany Bradley at UMass, and Carrie Brown-Lima at the New York Invasive Species Research Institute. We started with just a few people around the table. Now there's like almost 900 of us. We provide information to managers, and they also share back what they're learning and what they need, and it's this very two-way process. There's room for all of us at the table, so just you can check us out. I'm going to highlight some of the work we've done. One of the things we focused on early on was to do a survey of the managers and practitioners that we were working with. One of the things we learned right away is that more information is needed. So if you focus on just the gray bars, you find that the invasive managers were saying the biggest obstacles to managing invasive species effectively were funding and personnel. That's kind of as expected. But if you focus on the red, you can see that access to information and availability of information became bigger obstacles when we consider incorporating climate change into addressing invasive species. So we're like, great, that's our opening, We want to produce information, you need information. We also wanted to know, what did people want information about? And so we went through and found these different research topics, and we took those research topics and we worked on them. So we have graduate students that are addressing these. We produce peer-reviewed literature and management challenges, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So for example, they wanted to know about resilient ecosystems. So we set up a framework thinking about how do you think about resilience, both from the perspective of climate change and also the perspective of invasive species. We also heard that people wanted to know about sleeper species. So sleeper species are naturalized non-natives, like already in place, that people think are probably fine, except with climate change, warming in this region, and wetter, more precipitation, more disturbance, they might actually become invasive. So we were able to go through and produce lists of people of priority sleeper species. And that's my student Ayodele Uhuru worked on this. We also have been working on range shifting. So we took the framing of invasion ecology and applied it to thinking about as native species shift, are they going to become problems? And we've also thought of, so you can think about that as kind of nuisance neonatives, including the southern pine beetle, which has obviously been a big problem in New Jersey. We also wanted to ask our managers, where do you get information? And so we found this, one-on-one conversations with colleagues, but also meetings, symposia, management documents. So we do all those things in risk. I wanted to give one more example of work that I've done in that translational ecology space. So this was mentioned earlier, thinking about climate change refugia. These are areas relatively buffered from contemporary climate change that enable persistence of valued resources. This can be species, but it could also be like downhill skiing or other things that people care about, and livelihoods. So we can think about, we developed this refugia conservation cycle where you start out with your objective, you conduct a vulnerability assessment, you can revise your goals, and then you map the refugia and use that to help prioritize where actions are taking. It's kind of all about prioritizing the limited time and resources that managers have. So for example, work out of Massachusetts has shown that these in blue are the stream reaches where we think that brook trout will persist into a very hot future. So we can think about taking action at these places to conserve those for the brook trout. Another example from the Northeast, we did work on looking at vernal pool refugia. These are really important to amphibians and fairy shrimp, places that are ephemeral pools. They're not ponds, so they don't have predators like fish. And we were able to identify the places that seem like they're going to be persisting into the future, and those could, again, be then conserved for those important resources. We can then talk to the managers and say, like, what actions would you take there, and these are the actions that you might prioritize in those particular places. So we go through this cycle of thinking about generating the hypotheses and testing them, and then working through to inform management action. Finally, in the spirit of thinking about how we can work together on this, one takeaway I would say is that we can talk to each other, our neighbors, our friends, and family, about climate change. And this is a new book from Catherine Hayhoe that tells you how to talk to people. As scientists, we're not really necessarily that good at that. She's also a scientist, and she's done really great work on this. And one thing we learned from our survey from our invasive species managers is that we found that managers that were more concerned about climate change were the ones much more likely to do something about it. So they were much more likely to incorporate climate change into their day-to-day work if they were worried about climate change. Maybe that's obvious, but the way that people worry about things is by hearing about them, right? We just came off an election. You probably have heard all about this kind of thing recently. So I'll just finish by saying all this research is available on our web sites. We have a Refugia website, climaterefugia.org, and would be very happy. We have a Northeast site, happy to share other people's science there. And then at Risk Network, lots of great information there. And I'd be happy to take questions. Or not. Okay, or not. I would not like to take questions at this time.
Sorry. We'll save questions till the very end. So, and then, yeah, you should sit down there and not up here so you're not looking at the screen like that. Our next speaker is Dr. Jennifer Powers. She's from the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior at the University of Minnesota, and she'll be talking to us about tropical dry forests in Central America. You good?
Hello? Got this? Thank you so much. I'm gonna, sorry. Sorry. First, I want to say thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. I haven't spent much time in New Jersey, mostly. I've been to Newark, to the airport, but I think it is such an underrated airport. But anyway, it's a pleasure to be here with you today and to talk for only 15 minutes, not 15 hours or days, about one of my favorite biomes, the tropical dry forest. And this talk, it's perfect. Dr. Gonzalez, Dr. Morelli really set me up well for what I'm going to talk to you about. So we're going to be focusing on the bosque seco, the dry forest. And this is the question that keeps me up at night, among other things. You know, will seasonally dry tropical forests be resilient or vulnerable to changes in climate? So these are the 5 points that I want to touch on in the next 15 minutes. First, I want to introduce the topic of tropical forests and drought very broadly. You know, most people might think, well, hey, tropical forests, they get lots of rain. What's the big deal? Then I want to zoom in to a region in Costa Rica where we've been working, our team has been working there over 20 years, and I want to focus on this question about tropical trees and drought through the lens of hydraulic traits, and present some data that suggests they are indeed vulnerable. Then I want to zoom back out and ask the question, okay, this research that we've done in Costa Rica, can we generalize this to other places in the dry tropics? Next, I want to shift focus and move from a more sort of basic framework to a more applied framework and ask, you know, what we're learning about drought and tropical tree species, does this help us with other things like restoration? And I'm going to conclude with a plea from natural scientists like me, someone who, you know, measures trees, that what we really need is to be collaborating across disciplines, across stakeholder groups. So thanks everyone for setting up my talk perfectly. Okay. So why work in tropical forests? As a carbon-centric person like myself, it's a great place to work. This slide here shows the distribution of land area by non-forest and forest. That's the panel on the left. And the panel in white on the left shows the breakdown of the aerial coverage of tropical forests by biome. And you can see, or sorry, of forest by biome. You can see that tropical forests account for about 40% more of the total forested area compared to temperate forest, and a little bit more compared to boreal forest. On the right panel, you can see that carbon stocks, carbon that's stored in the biomass, carbon stored in the soils, occupy in tropical forest over 50% of the total forest carbon stock. And this is because of their high carbon densities and their large aerial coverage. So it's a good place to work if you care about carbon. It's also a good place to work if you care about biodiversity. This is a map that shows the global ecoregions for vascular plant species richness, and you can see that tropical forests, or the low latitudes, contain more vascular plant species than higher latitudes. You know, we know this. We could look at this graph for birds, or for butterflies, or for other taxa. This is a well-known pattern. Perhaps what is less well known is that there are lots of different kinds of tropical forests. Not all tropical forests are rainforest. And in fact, in our team, we've been working in seasonally dry tropical forests for years, decades, really. This is the Guanacaste Conservation Area in Costa Rica. You can see the same view from the wet and the dry season. And in general, dry tropical forests have lower total annual rainfall, and the rain that does fall occurs with a distinct seasonality, wet seasons alternating with dry seasons. Tropical dry forests, as we've heard, have been vastly impacted by people. They've been preferentially cleared for agriculture, and they contain unique and endemic, often endemic biodiversity. So this is the question here that keeps me up at night. Will seasonally dry tropical forests be vulnerable or resistant to climate? And when we wrote this paper in 2017, I was agnostic. I just wanted to know, like, what's the answer? And some people had said to me, oh, dry forest and climate, it's not a big deal. These are species that are adapted to seasonal drought, and so they have adaptations to cope with drought. Different people told me, oh my gosh, tropical dry forest and drought, these are going to be systems that are very, very vulnerable to climate change because they're already operating at their hydrologic limit. And I said, well, I just want to know, tell me, which is it? What's the answer? So what I'm going to do is walk you through some data we've collected on tree mortality that helps us understand this question. We've been working in the northwestern part of Costa Rica now for over 20 years, in the dry forests of the Área de Conservación Guanacaste and Arenal Tempisque. And the questions to think about are, is drought linked to tree mortality? If so, which species are vulnerable? And then, are there characteristics or traits, properties of these species that help us understand their vulnerability and that maybe we could use to predict drought in other forests? Ooh, I did not mean to do that, sorry. Talk's gone. Anyway, so these are the rainfall data for Santa Rosa in the Guanacaste Conservation Area in Costa Rica. And you can see that annual rainfall is variable. It can be over 3 meters a year, it can be less than 1 meter a year, but in 2015, it was very, very low. This was the lowest recorded rainfall, the lowest rainfall on record. And we wanted to know, how did this extreme drought event affect forest dynamics, and in particular, tree mortality? And we were lucky because we'd been studying the dynamics of forests in some plots since about 2008. So in 2008, we established 18 forest inventory plots in secondary forests. These are early to intermediate to mature secondary forests. You can see them here in the bottom panel. We love them all, just like you love all your children. We love all our plots. And what we found here, only one laugh. What we found here, what we've done is plot the plot level mortality rate on the left vertical axis, rainfall on the right vertical axis. And you can see from this graph, the plot level mortality rate is about 1 to 3%. So each year, maybe 1 to 3% of the trees in these plots die. By contrast, in 2015, the year of this extreme drought, the rates of tree mortality doubled to tripled in these plots. And mortality remained elevated into 2016, even though the rainfall had returned to normal. So I would argue here, these are correlative data, but I would argue that these are strong data of a link between mortality and drought. So our next question was, given that drought is linked to this tree mortality, what about the biodiversity in this site? This site has very high biodiversity. Are all species affected equally? And what we found was no. This plot shows the mortality rate for 55 species. So we had 55 tree species, these are listed on the bottom, that we could estimate the mortality rate during the drought. And what we found was that some species are very vulnerable to drought. They lost over 35% of the individuals of that species. Other species seem to be very, very resistant to drought. In the face of this very strong drought, these were species that didn't lose anybody, basically. And so our next question was, okay, great. within one seasonally dry tropical forest, we see this range of vulnerability to drought. Some species are very resistant, some species are very vulnerable. Are there properties of these tree species that help us understand this variability? So, I'm proud of this graph. It took us about 3 years to construct. Little embarrassing, but what we show here are pairwise scatter graphs for many, many variables that we measured for each of these species, or for most of these species. So we wanted to know what helps us understand this variability. We measured a lot of traits. The first thing we did was measure the soft traits, the easy traits. Wood density, specifically area, foliar nitrogen, etc. Those did not help us understand mortality. Right. So it took us a long time we had to bring in some plant physiologists, and they helped us measure hydraulic traits. So this was what took us 2 years, and this was the answer here. So this top bar shows the mortality rate of different species during the drought, plotted as a function of these different variables we measured for them. And you can see here, these 3 significant correlations were between hydraulic traits. The hydraulic trait that best helped us understand vulnerability to drought is the hydraulic safety margin. I'm not going to go into that, but some species, they spend water, they use water, and then when it dries down, they're stuck. They have already suffered vascular damage. Other species, when they start to dry out, they say, I'm not going to risk it. They shut down their stomata. These are species that survive a drought. So can we generalize to other ecosystems? We've learned a lot in Costa Rica. Does it help us understand anywhere else? We visited these, here's our site in Costa Rica. We visited basically where our friends work. So we established international partnerships. We went to Mexico, to Colombia, and to Puerto Rico. This work was led by Herman Vargas, who was a PhD student in my lab. And what he did was to go to all of these places and collect the same physiological measurements. But for Colombia, Costa Rica, Mexico, and Puerto Rico, for dry forest there. And the first thing we did was to put all the climate data onto one graph. And what we found, if we look at annual mortality or the seasonality, was that there are many different ways to be a tropical dry forest. The Costa Rica site we've been working in has high rainfall, but very high seasonality. And so when we summarize the hydraulic safety margin, we multiply basically all of the data, the species-specific values, but weighted by the relative abundance of species in those communities, we find that indeed the site in Costa Rica, the community there has the lowest hydraulic safety margin. It's the community we would have predicted to be most vulnerable to drought. So these hydraulic data give us a good understanding that we can use tools from physiology to help us understand, what's going on in forests. But can this help us with very pressing problems facing society? Can this help us in restoration? My group has gradually been moving from, shifting from basic to applied work. This is one example. Here, this is a student, Leland Worden. He planted 30 different species of native trees. He did it during the drought, so this was a climate change experiment. And he measured physiological traits. And these traits were well correlated with the survivorship of trees planted out in a restoration experiment. This was a good example of how we can use tools from basic physiological ecology to help us select restoration viable species. So again, as we've shifted from doing this basic ecology to more applied ecology, my group has learned one thing. That thing is that we can't do it alone. We're measuring seedlings, we're measuring nutrients, we're measuring, hydraulic conductivity. What we really need to do if we want to achieve restoration outcomes is to partner with people like social scientists. So this is a plea here that I made for really saying, hey, I'm a natural scientist, I'm looking at seedlings, I'm looking at this. If I want to do restoration, I need help. We need to be talking to social scientists who can help us design people-centric restoration. We need to be talking to economists who can help us attach value to the different management practices that we're doing. We need help with geographers mapping restoration potential. And maybe most importantly, we need to be reaching out to stakeholders. This is Milena Gutierrez. She was the forester in the Horizontes Experimental Forestry and Restoration Station, where our research is based in Costa Rica. And my friends and I have developed an NGO to help form partnerships or build communities among people who are interested in managing, conserving, and restoring tropical dry forests. This was one of our meetings, 2015. So last, take-home messages. Dry forests respond to drought, but species-specific responses depend on the hydraulic traits. And we can use these measurements to help us understand variability across the dry forest biome. We can also use this kind of ecological studies to help us partner with restoration practitioners and design better, more resilient restoration programs. And last, restoring dry forests is going to take much more than us growing some seedlings and looking at the nutrients or the hydraulic traits. We really need to be facilitating these interdisciplinary collaborations to achieve restoration. That's it.
So if you would like to hear more about Dr. Power's work, she is giving the departmental seminar, a joint seminar actually between environmental sciences and geography, and that's happening tomorrow from 2 to 3 o'clock in the Olampi room over in the Department of Marine and Coastal Sciences, so over on SEBS campus. So if you want more, and you want to hear more, and a little bit of apparently a dry forest travel log, dry tropical forest travel log, then absolutely join that. So our next, they're going out afterwards. Oh, right. I was like, where's the dry tropical forest in New Jersey? I don't know. But they're skipping the going outside and they're going for wine. So that would be another good chance to circulate and network with folks who might be interested in the same things that you're interested in. So finally, we get to go homegrown a little bit, and we bring up Dr. Kevin St. Martin, who's the chair of geography, and he'll be talking about climate change and fisheries and the communities that rely on them. Kevin is where? Oh, right there.
Okay, thank you. Great. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Well, hello, everybody, and thanks so much for the organizers for inviting me here. It's really an honor, and I feel privileged and happy to be here. So I'm going to be talking about communities in fishing communities in the Northeast and in New Jersey, but across the entire Northeast, and the question of climate change and response to climate change. And I want to just start by locating myself, right? I'm a geographer, I'm a social scientist here at Rutgers University. I have long been interested in fisheries, but in terms of sort of local economy and questions of economic possibility in coastal communities. I'm also very much engaged as sort of, I guess you could say, a bit applied. I'm very much engaged in fisheries management in the Northeast. That is, I sit on a number of committees and so on, and have been involved in developing policy. And there I can tell you that there's a real struggle to even include climate change in fisheries science and management, that sort of regime of management that exists. And I've also, as a social scientist, been interested in that management as a sort of research topic in itself. And I'm particularly curious about how that management works in terms of sort of what it imagines to exist and not exist, sort of the categories that it uses, the units of analyses, and sort of the modes of decision-making that management utilizes. And in my work, I can tell you a lot about that, but I'm just going to tell you two things. One is that fisheries science and management is largely a numeric endeavor. That is, it's all about the quantification of fish stock and sort of the allocation of those quantities. And the other thing that I think it's important to know about fisheries management is that makes seeing communities really challenging. That is, the sort of spatialization of the distribution of access to fish is very hard to imagine in fisheries science and management. It's not that people don't know it exists. Of course they know it exists, but they don't collect data on it. They don't present data on it. They don't incorporate that data into decision making. Okay, so climate change, though, I think is disrupting this sort of regime quite a bit. That is, climate change in fisheries has to be, and is understood primarily to be, about warming waters. And those warming waters are warming rapidly in the northeast of the United States, and fish are responding rapidly, like much quicker than trees, right? They're moving with the change in temperature to new places, right? It's all about fish abundance and its distribution. And once you introduce that, right, this is exactly the thing that fisheries science can't really deal with, fisheries management can't really deal with because it's highly numeric, is that spatialization of climate change, right? And once we start talking about that, we can't help but also start talking about differential impacts geographically. Some communities are going to bear the brunt of climate change and others are not. This might be obvious to all of us, but it's not something that's incorporated into the management regime itself. So that's really my starting point. So this is just a story about how can we see communities in a lot of ways as a social scientist. So let me try to do this quickly. Of course, NOAA, the National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration and its Fisheries Division, does focus to some degree on communities and is very much interested in their vulnerability to climate change. And so they primarily take, however, a kind of what you might call a sort of demographic or statistical based on census kind of approach. Which communities along the coast, meaning municipalities, which municipalities along the coast have certain properties that make them vulnerable to climate change, but also vulnerable in some sense, you could say, to management itself. And so that's a very sort of, you could say, a sort of port-based and demographic approach to understanding vulnerability or even response to climate change. Which communities can bear the brunt and which cannot. You'll notice that it doesn't connect people to the areas in the ocean itself. That is, the thing being managed, the fish offshore, is largely disconnected from this idea of community onshore, right? So my work and the work that I'm working with a lot of my friends are trying to make that connection. And to do so, we are using data that is self-reported by fishermen and has been since 1994. And this is basically logbook data of where a boat goes. And you can see the map on the right that where fishing trips might go. There are many, many, many hundreds of thousands of fishing trips over 25, 30 years, and they occupy this whole area in the ocean. That is, there's a whole landscape out there of human engagement, right? And that's sort of our starting point for trying to get at the impact of climate change, which is to say when species distributions, abundances and distributions change, do fishing practices in the ocean itself change? We can take that data, and the formula on the left, obviously you don't need to know any of that. It's a way to take these trips and aggregate them by and to those port-based communities. That is, we can make a link between a port-based community and its fishing practices offshore. What kinds of patterns do we see offshore? What kinds of changes in those patterns might exist due to climate change, due to species moving about? Right? And of course, you can aggregate that data and you can start making maps like this. Where does Point Pleasant most often go fishing? This is the place in the ocean where you can most often find them. Does that territory, that location, that footprint change when species change or not, right? Which suggests an opening for different adaptive strategies. Are they going to follow fish? Are they going to switch species? So on and so forth, right? So that's the idea there. This kind of data is also really useful for engaging communities directly. That is, you can make these maps with all these sort of areas defined on the maps. You can bring them into fishing communities, and you can say, okay, what does this mean to you? Do you, what is your experience of this place in the ocean? How is its environment changing? What do you know about the species and their mix in these locations, and so on and so forth? Which is to say, once you get to this level of community and sort of oceanic practice, you can really sort of open the door to relating to fishermen directly in ways that their local ecological knowledge is privileged. You can also take this data and incorporate it into sort of the boom in oceanic databases that is going on right now. These kind of collections of data in data portals and so on, where there's often a need for, like, can you, the social scientist, bring me data about people and put this into our database around oceans and oceans management? And indeed, yes, this data can be incorporated and used in ways that are quite obvious. If you have these sort of footprints of where people go fishing, you could say, well, if we're going to put in a wind farm here, who are we going to impact? Which community is going to be in the way of that wind farm? The data was actually used in this sort of siting of an experimental area off the coast of Virginia. Very interesting. But to get back to climate change, well, you could start talking about climate change impacts in terms of those shifts in abundance and distribution in the ocean and say, well, which communities exactly are going to be affected by that and how, right? Really a sort of projecting into the future climate change climate changing habitats and distributions, and then saying, okay, which community is going to bear the brunt of that shift in species and distribution. And so let me just show you a few slides that kind of get at that. Here we have work by Lauren Rogers and friends, including myself, that used those footprints and used projections of habitat change to look at and see how which communities are going to be most affected. And so for the entire Northeast, those are all the footprints for different sorts of communities and gear types. And then you take those footprints and you say, right, within this footprint, the habitat has changed in a particular way or will in 20 or 30 years. Is that going to be suitable habitat now for codfish? Yes or no? Is that going to be suitable habitat for monkfish? Yes or no? And so on. And you could say then for each community, will where you go fishing regularly still have codfish or not, right? And then you can do that for all these for each community. That's on the bottom axis on the right here. And that dotted line is saying, well, if each of these communities, the location of each of these communities, their footprint in the ocean, is it still good habitat for codfish or not? If it were good habitat for codfish, the box would be above the line. They're all below, which is to say across the entire Northeast, habitat for codfish is disappearing. For monkfish, it's a little more less clear. We have some areas that's actually going to be good for monkfish and bad for monkfish in other areas. You can simply link that back to fishing communities, and then you can produce really snazzy graphs like this, which show all the communities on the left. Each line is a community. A community might catch, say, 3 or 4 or 5 different species. Those are the black dots. If the black dot is to the right of the line in the middle of the graph, it's saying, well, this is going to be good for that species. If it's on the other side, it's bad. The colored dot is the average, right? It's simply telling you that for most communities in the Northeast, the assemblage of species that they're catching are going to be, habitat will be declining for those species for most communities, not all species in all locations. It's this kind of community-based specificity of this that we're trying to get at. Okay, but what about sort of adaptive strategy? That's just telling us sort of which communities are being impacted. What if we also wanted to know, well, what kinds of capacities for adaptation do each community have? We can look at this past record of 20 or 25 years of where they went fishing, and we can read into that all kinds of questions about, are they following fish when the fish move or not, right? Are they switching species and staying in the same place? Are vessels moving to new port locations in looking for new territories and fishing grounds and so on? We can start asking these questions about actual adaptive strategies and link those to communities. So not just impact, but what kind of capacities do they have? If we look at shifting fishing grounds, who's moving where, what we've learned, and this is really counter to a lot of people's imagination of adaptation in fishing, is that most communities do not follow fish. That is, they don't actually leave their traditional fishing grounds very much. Those traditional fishing grounds could be really expansive for, say, big trawlers, or they could be very localized for lobster fishermen, but in both cases, they don't go to new fishing grounds. Very rarely, very rarely. What we see here on the left, these are trend analyses showing us some communities. The one on the very far left is Beaufort, North Carolina. You can see that it indeed does travel and has over the time series. The blue areas are getting colder, the red areas are getting hotter. We see a movement in space of where they go fishing. They do indeed follow fish. It turns out they're a bit of an aberration in the entire Northeast. Most communities are like these on the right in New Jersey, where you see that there's movement within a traditional fishing ground. Maybe they're going a little further north, maybe a little further east toward cooler water, but they're still within their traditional fishing grounds. We learned from fishermen themselves, we did a lot of interviews around this, that they don't like traveling. They like going where they know. The preferred strategy by fishermen is to switch species, which is to say they need and want the flexibility to fish a variety of species. And we see that in this data set, we can look precisely at how those mix of species have changed in their catch, in their targeting for different communities. And in our interviews with them, they said by far this is their preferred strategy. They see it as they actually see it as a sustainable form of adaptation, that when a species is overfished, they can move to another species and so on. What they've also reported to us is that that flexibility is becoming less and less possible, not just because of climate change, but largely because of management itself, which forces them into licensing structures and other ways that make it so that they no longer have the ability to switch from one species to another. And we can take these sort of data that we have on this and turn them into sort of region-wide metrics. I won't go into this because I'm a little bit behind time, but safe to say we can create region-wide metrics on the mobility of communities, and we can create region-wide metrics on their sort of propensity to flexibly switch their species catch. The last variable, though, that adaptive strategy might say that I'm really interested in, and I think this one really opens up to the question of environmental justice, which I haven't mentioned much, but was in the title of the talk, is this idea of movement between ports by different vessels, which is to say, once we started looking into this data, interested in adaptive capacity, what we see is a lot of these communities actually no longer exist over time. That is, we have all these communities listed in 1995, fishing communities up and down the coast, lots and lots of small communities. By the time we get to 2020, 2022, they fall out from the data set. And we're like, what's going on? Are these vessels just moving to another port, or are they going out of business? That's kind of one of our outstanding questions we're still working on. But it has these implications for if they're moving to other ports, then there's a consolidation going on, which is to say fishing effort is consolidating in certain ports, leaving others behind. And we can look at that data. The graphs here, what you see is on the right-hand side for sort of small trawlers. We can see that if you compare the left and the right-hand side, on the left-hand side is very early in the data set, and you can see that between ports there was little mobility, which is to say the big red bar is telling you a vessel that leaves that port returns to the same port. And on the right-hand side, what you see is those red bars getting smaller, which is to say there's more mobility between ports. That was our initial thing, but then once we started looking at it more closely across the entire region, we could start to see very clearly that there were sending ports and receiving ports, which kind of gets at this idea of consolidation, which is to say fishing activity is getting more and more consolidated in fewer and fewer ports. I'm sorry I can't go through that beautiful graph that our friend Leo made for us. I'm going to skip that and go to the question of environmental justice, and then I'll just finish up. So environmental justice, thanks to the federal mandate that is making all federal agencies incorporate ways of addressing environmental justice, we see in fisheries that this is happening as well. I think that's really a positive and important thing. What's interesting in fisheries is that they've defined communities that might be at risk or that are, quote, underserved, to not just be population-based, meaning sort of questions of race and ethnicity and so on, and population. They're also geographically based, which is to say the geography really matters. And what we know from our analysis is that so many of these communities are disappearing, and that raises this question of environmental justice. I'm just going to show you this last slide. It's a crazy slide. It's a crazy slide, but it is the most beautiful slide, I must tell you. I love this slide. And again, our friend Leo made this for us. What we see here is every line is a fishing community. If you start on the upper left, you're in the very north of Maine. And then you go down, you're going further and further and further and further south. And then in the next column, you're in New York, you're going further and further south. The last column is Massachusetts, and you start in the north of Massachusetts, you go all the way. So you can start to see this amazing regional picture. What the colors are telling you is that these are different these are different gear types. The red is lobstering, the blue is trawling, the black is dredge fishing. And so for every community, you can see how is it doing in terms of the mix of gear types, the diversity of fishing in that community, the sort of ability to be flexible, and so on. And what this data tells us for the entire region is that flexibility is going down, diversity is declining, and a lot of communities have simply ceased to exist. If you look if you go down, say, the coast of Maine, if you look all the way to the right, you're in the most recent data set, and you can see that there's a lot of gray boxes. It's telling you there's no fishing activity in that community. If you start, starting on the other side, you can see, oh, there's a diversity of color for that port. There's 2 or 3 gear types. All the way to the right, there's none anymore. Or there might be a red line, which is to say lots of Maine has now become lobstering and lobstering alone. Again, a loss of diversity of gear types, a loss of diversity of fishing opportunities, and so on. My argument is simply that once we look at community and we start looking at these variables, climate change is pushing us to think about environmental justice and sort of region-wide change in industry and trajectory that I think we should all pay a lot of attention to. So thank you very much.
Okay, so our final panelist will join us remotely, and this is Dr. Kate Orff from Columbia University. She directs the Urban Design Program and co-directs the Center for Resilient Cities and Landscapes. And so she'll be taking us to think about what are some solutions that involve biodiversity and allowing urban centers to sort of survive and thrive in this era of climate change.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Glad to be here. And thank you for inviting me to participate in this important conference. I'm really on the far side, the spectrum of the practitioner. I'm not a scientist, but my work is inspired by the best available science, really on the ground trying to make change and fold in forms of biodiversity into the world that we have made, and being very direct and applied in that mission. I'm a landscape architect by training, and I'm also a professor at Columbia. I'm going to speak today quickly about living breakwaters and a project which is currently under construction in Tottenville, in Raritan Bay and Staten Island. This is a project that's around a 2,400 linear foot system of nearshore breakwaters. And in addition to the breakwater system that you see pictured here, it also includes a shoreline restoration component, a one-time sand replenishment, and active restoration on the breakwater units themselves. This is a project that emerged after the 2012 Superstorm Sandy event in a kind of a national competition designed to, bring innovation in infrastructure to the region, and not just to kind of replicate what was there. So let's talk about biodiversity and infrastructure. I've titled my talk "Living Infrastructure" because I see actual, a robust diversity, robust biodiversity as a form of infrastructure that somehow we have taken for granted. Here, pictured here, you can see active oyster restoration in the New York Bay, and oysters themselves are a form of living infrastructure. They can filter excess nutrients out of our water bodies. They can slow the water, clean the water, and make our water bodies more habitable. In terms of climate change, our water bodies are not what they were 200 years ago. We have more sedimented water. We have a more turbulent water. We have dirtier water. And we've also, essentially reduced in the New York Harbor in our region, the amount of oysters to essentially 1% of their historic extents. And so in general, in design, we've really tried to promulgate the idea that we need to consider the life cycle needs of non-humans in every project that we do. Here's an image of the life cycle of an oyster, as it moves from egg to larvae to spat on shell to an adult male or female oyster growing in a reef. And so as part of the inspiration for this project, we kind of reinterpreted the life cycle of the oyster into an urban context here, with this general thesis that a big part of becoming more resilient would be connecting people in the Northeast, New Yorkers, to their harbor, and that biodiversity is not only a kind of a form of protective benefit in terms of reducing climate risk, it's also a form of community building. So after the HUD competition post Superstorm Sandy, we developed this idea further in the form of the concept of the Living Breakwater Project. And so what do breakwaters do? They do not stop flooding, full stop, but they do reduce risk. And our concept was really threefold. We wanted to reduce coastal risk, taking that kind of harmful wave energy out of the water bodies. In South Staten Island, very tragically, people lost their lives. We had boats colliding with houses, homes knocked off their foundations, etc. And our goal was to also revive ecosystems, particularly marine ecosystems, bringing back that absolutely critical intertidal and subtidal habitat that we have largely removed from our harbor. And then thirdly, to really increase social resilience by bringing educators to the shore in the form of the Billion Oyster Project. But for the purposes of this next 8 minutes, I'm really going to focus on that second project goal, which is reviving ecosystems and kind of bringing biodiversity back to our harbor. So the breakwaters themselves are unique and designed for not only oysters, but for juvenile fish. And in the life cycle of the fish, the project is located here where my mouse is. This is when fish are, especially bass fish, are in their kind of juvenile stage of their lifespan. So the breakwaters themselves are not just typical stone breakwaters. They're designed really to create niches and kind of enhance the kind of surface macro and micro complexity. We're not actually at an oyster reef like you can see imaged on the right, but we're trying to mimic that complexity through the form and the macro form of the breakwater itself, whereas a typical breakwater is kind of a straight, linear, very uniform piece of physical infrastructure. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen, a living breakwater has porous space. It has reef ridges or reef streets that you can see here where smaller fish can shelter in structure, feed in the street. And so it has this kind of multiple degrees of macro and micro complexity to really support marine biological life in multiple forms. So, where do we start with these projects beyond oyster restoration science? And there is so much happening in the New York, New Jersey harbor. We're part of kind of science working groups. We also just started with culture, because to build projects and advance transformative projects in communities, this requires establishing coalitions and establishing stakeholders. And so in order to do that, we actually look to the past. This is a painting of oyster tongers in Staten Island. And you can see in the image in the top left, everything in dark teal represented these massive historic beds. Those beds were later transformed into farms, but generally Staten Island, Perth Amboy, and cities in small towns in this area were actually formed around oysters, and Tottenville was known as the town that the oyster built. So here's an image on the left of tonging for oysters in Brereton Bay, and that sort of historic extensive oyster beds overlaid. Again, these are at 0 now, or less than 1%, excuse me. This is a moment where we had leased beds. This entire zone hatched in yellow is where we were farming oysters in leased beds. You can see oysters working from standing ground in Staten Island. And essentially, to me, this was a very inspirational moment in our history that I think we can learn from today, because biodiversity will not sort of come back or advance in new forms without what I would call a nature assist. And so the goal here is to develop an infrastructure that is reducing risk, but also providing this sort of substrate for new oyster and shellfish to grab onto and take hold. We're piloting 5 different forms of urban oyster restoration, including spat on shell, concrete, e-concrete oyster discs attached to subtidal units, tankless setting, etc. We've engaged schools on the waterfront through our partners at the Billion Oyster Project. We now have around 15 schools and have helped try to develop a kind of a broader movement that is very shareable through this Oyster Garden manual. We participated in teaching activities and learning activities with the purpose of not just developing and delivering a physical project, but as you can see on the screen here, building a culture of resilience in the next generation. And then of course, the breakwater structures themselves were designed for habitat enhancements. I won't go into the range of physical enhancements, but you can see at the bottom of the slide, they include tide poles and bioenhanced armor units and a range of strategies. Quickly, describing ecosystems as infrastructure means that they also must be tested and vetted. This project has been tested in multiple digital models at multiple scales of resolution. It was also tested in a physical wave tank, as you can see here. The entire project has been developed essentially as an experimental, a large one-to-one experiment where these different kind of concepts for restoration are tracked and located. And essentially, this is an image of these kind of systems overlaid. And the entire set of breakwaters actually has a control and is set up as a one-to-one experiment that will be monitored. And so you can see just 2 examples of A1 and A2, which are already in water here. And you can see the ridges and that I'll point out to you in a future photo indicated in a future piece. So again, we're piloting oyster restoration techniques on the breakwater structure. It has to be effective for risk reduction on day 1, but the hope is that the oysters will grow and develop over time and help provide this kind of biological glue on top of the structure, with the big picture of, I'm talking about oysters, but they're just one tiny piece of an intact coastal ecosystem that we are rapidly losing, not, in the entire East Coast. And here you'll recognize a picture of a horseshoe crab in the foreground and a red knot bird in the background. All of these marine species are deeply interrelated. The shallow intertidal landscapes that are needed for horseshoe crabs to lay eggs in and nest are absolutely critical. They're enabled by offshore reef structures like oysters, and then red knots, migratory birds, are highly dependent on the eggs of the horseshoe crab. So I just wanted to emphasize, it's not just about designing for one thing. We're thinking holistically about the systems of and interrelated species that are highly dependent on each other, just as we are dependent on marine life for food and for other aspects. This project is under construction now. You can see I indicated the reef ridges here. So the goal is to kind of really expand intertidal and subtidal habitat. You can see the tidal pools just inundated. And here at a lower tide. And so we're very excited. It's been 8 years in the making. This was initiated as a fast track project that received federal funding after Superstorm Sandy, but I will be very direct in that it has required an incredible amount of federal, state, and local coordination and regulatory coordination in order to make this project happen. We're really excited that it has become a kind of a beacon for marine life, with seals like the seal named Stanley hauling out bald eagles and already clams, fish, and many others kind of species coming in its wake. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. And I look forward to our group discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. And if you stay on, that would be great, because you can participate in our panel discussion. So I'll invite our panel folks to come up, including Patrick. Yeah, let's give them one nice hand. That was a really fantastic group. So I'm going to start us off with a question, but you guys should, if you have questions, you can start to filter in. And again, we prioritize our students and grad students to ask questions first, and then we'll rotate through. But we have a good 30 minutes for, I hope, a good discussion. So, so I'm going to throw you back to your days of defending your PhD and ask you, for your 2-minute elevator pitch, as it were, on the importance of tying the way we think about climate change to biodiversity. Those are two things I think have historically been discussed separately, right? And part of what we're doing today is trying to make it clear that you can't solve one without the other, that there's a very tight link between them, not just the climate change impacts on biodiversity, but the biodiversity impacts on climate change. So I don't know who wants to go first, but I might, this is recorded, which is great, because I'm going to maybe steal some of your 1-minute pieces to try to tie these things together. So I'll let you guys give it a shot.
Who's going to go first? Who's going to tackle it?
Can you restate the question?
So pretend I was President Biden, and you're trying to convince me that it's worth a good extra chunk of money to come towards solving the biodiversity and climate change crisis. And in fact, we have to link them together, and so why?
Well, ecosystems sustain human well-being. In addition to being important on their own right, plants, animals have their own right to live. Our well-being depends on healthy, functioning ecosystems to provide us clean air, clean water, timber, the food that we eat, and published scientific research shows that human-caused climate change is already damaging the health of ecosystems and their ability to provide us with the, everything that we need to survive and thrive in a changing world. And so solutions that address the destruction of habitat through deforestation, through fragmented development, and solutions that address the human carbon pollution that drives climate change will both help sustain the well-being and prosperity of us in the United States and around the world. And in addition, by conserving biodiversity, high biodiversity places also store a lot of carbon. And so the same solutions can address two problems.
Excellent. You pass. Anybody else?
Yeah, I
Chair,
can
Tony?
add to that. So I think we had a biodiversity crisis before we knew that we had an anthropogenic climate change crisis. So we now have a lot of attention on climate change, and that gives us the resources to be dealing with both at once. And I'll just add to what Dr. Gonzalez said as an example. I've also worked a lot in the tropics, and there are places in which we could make an argument for carbon sequestration to plant, for example, eucalyptus in Madagascar, which grow really fast, but can poison the soil and are not going to replace the tropical rainforest that the lemurs need there. I think we know that if we think for just a moment that climate change is a long-term issue, right? That's one of the problems with trying to keep people's attention on it, is that it's not usually affecting us today unless it's a hurricane or some big climate disturbance. So we also need long-term solutions for that. We need to be doing things that will, for the long term, be solving problems, both for biodiversity and for climate change, and not just in the short term dealing with carbon sequestration, but that in the long term will have biodiversity, negative impacts to biodiversity.
I guess I'll go next. Thanks, and I agree with all of these, and just build on that. The systems where I've spent most of my career working, these nature-based solutions, stopping deforestation, promoting regeneration of forests, these go hand in hand with biodiversity. I came to study tropical forests as an ecosystems ecologist, as a person just wanting to measure carbon. And after years, you sort of look around and you say, wow, there's a lot of biodiversity here too. I think they go hand in hand together. So solutions, nature-based solutions to helping us get to where we need to be in terms of climate can also work with, can go hand in hand with biodiversity.
Just quickly, and maybe from a really somewhat different perspective as a social scientist who working with fishermen, right? So just the relationship between climate change and biodiversity, two things that a lot of the fishermen I work with have been resistant to even thinking in terms of. Indeed, thinking about environmental change to a lot of them is about an obvious and observable cyclicality to nature. And then when we're working with them and bringing them data that says, well, the change that you've seen over the last 10 years is actually permanent and not cyclical, it's forcing them to think really differently about the environment itself, which is to say, climate change compels us and them, I think, to start thinking in terms of the environment and its robustness and its diversity and its future in ways that is different than extracting a single species from that year after year. Yeah.
I'll weigh in.
Yeah.
I would advocate for the idea of a national ecological landscape framework. I feel like we have federal agencies like the EPA and the National Park Service, but what we don't have are the interconnected networks of landscapes that will sustain species now and into the future, we hope. And I would think that a bigger picture framework plan like this could also be paired with, similar to what we're doing in Living Breakwaters, with an educational initiative around hands-on science-based applied learning for our nation's high schoolers. I think we need big, bold vision, and we don't have that right now at the national, federal level.
Thank you for indulging that. Those are great answers. And so I do want to invite people to come on up, but while you're making your way up, I do want to ask one thing. I mean, when you talk about climate change, it's easy to get depressed, honestly. It's a lot of bad news. It's scary in a lot of ways. And so I wanted to kind of give you guys a chance to maybe highlight what you think are the promising solutions or the promising trends that you've seen so far, because I do think that that's something that we undersell, that we are making progress and there are things you can do. It is a problem that we can affect, and so getting that message across is important. So I'm curious to what you think are the best, or from your experience maybe, what are the positive sort of messages you see coming out?
Well, I'll briefly recap what you've already heard this briefly. California reduced its emissions 11%, while its population increased 17%. The United States, renewable energy exceeds coal now for the first time since the 1880s, and globally we've installed renewable energy equivalent to 6,500 new coal-fired power plants. The challenge is very serious, but the countries of the world and the IPCC has shown that with concerted global action, we can halt climate change and protect the Earth. And so I have optimism. It's a science-based optimism that we can do this.
I would like to add to that and suggest, well, one thing that a lot of the news about climate change, a lot of the science about climate change, a lot of the stories we tell about climate change, I think there's a danger in some sense of constructing the monster we can't slay, right? Creating something that is ultimately paralyzing rather than something we feel like we can tackle. And so I think in some sense, the onus is on us as researchers and as scientists to deliberately and methodically and strategically foreground many, many, many of the actions and activities that people are engaged in that are addressing climate change, right? Which is to say, the hopeful bits, like rather than saving them to the very end of your article that was, why not put it at the top of your article and start with the hopefulness? What kind of science and analysis, what kind of narratives might we tell if we started from a kind of foregrounding and making visible the range and ubiquity of actions that communities are taking all around the world to address climate change? Like, how would that change our sort of affective relationship to climate change itself and possibility?
I'll say that that one of the things that gives me hope, well, literally, I'm paid to. My job is to watch trees grow, and that's a really gratifying, a gratifying and privileged job to have. I just want to highlight the role of education in sort of spreading hope and optimism. I'm fortunate to work in a protected area in Costa Rica, and they, in the 80s, they realized that they would not be able to survive as a protected area embedded in an agricultural landscape unless the local communities bought in to this idea that they were getting value from being next to, being neighbors to a protected area. So they set up an environmental education program that's been in action since then, where 4th, 5th, and 6th graders in the 50 schools that are in this province visit the conservation area 12 times over those 3 years, and they're interacting with the biodiversity, with their understanding the water cycle, you know, why the cloud forests are giving us water in the lowlands. And now this program has, you know, now there are 2 generations, basically, of people in this landscape who have gone through this environmental education program. And the benefits, I think, the conservation area is reaping the benefits of having people who live around them, their neighbors now, are totally sold on why it's valuable to have this protected area in their landscape. So I think education, there is a very vital role of education in helping us spread this message.
I get hopeful that we're finally beginning to democratize science and make it more accessible to people and less exclusive. And it's like too little too late, but we're on the path finally. I feel like I'm in many, many conversations, hours and hours of conversations every week where people are trying to figure out how to make jobs, these fantastic jobs we have. Like, we love our jobs. We have such great jobs, and they should be available not just to people who grew up white and middle class and like of the majority in our country, not to mention around the world. And that makes me hopeful because people are talking about it. They're not quite figuring out, you know, they're trying to figure out how to solve this. It's going to take a long time. There's systemic problems. But I'm really excited about the initiatives that have started in the last several years, and I think we're going to go in a good direction with it, which is so important because everyone should have these opportunities open, and also because we need everyone's ideas to solve these super complicated, very, very challenging issues of with the environment, and so we need everyone on board.
Kate, do you want to add, or?
I'm partly hopeful. I feel like, you know, it's very difficult. I do feel like I would just say there's a role to play in terms of my profession or maybe your students relative to constantly describing the interconnectedness of things and what actually constitutes a climate breakdown or a loss of biodiversity. Because I do feel like we're on this path where climate change is baked in, that sea levels are rising. We have these interrelated systems now that are imperiling non-human species, full stop. So I do feel like it's sort of on us to chart that out and map that out and not assume that, you know, what we have today is even acceptable, right? We already have rather extreme loss of biodiversity in many sectors. And so what is it that we need to do to be able to visualize loss, make it impactful for people, and kind of make the choices that we make today very, very tangible relative to the world that you know, this next generation is going to inherit. There's a landscape architect named Ian McHarg who wrote about this concept of shifting baselines, and I don't know if it's something that's known or not, but it's basically like you know, when you're born, you assume the world is as it always was, and I do feel like there's a role to kind of reframe the landscapes that have sustained us as incredibly bountiful, as being thriving, teeming, lush places, you know, not like seven fish holding on for dear life in one tiny spot. But, you know, so let's figure out how to describe this in a visual and very visceral way and raise the stakes for this, what needs to happen, which is a very, very rapid energy transition.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to add just one more thing. I'm sitting here thinking about how we've been using the word hope and hopefulness, and I feel bad for introducing it in a way, because I think I don't mean I don't mean that, you know, we should foreground hopefulness for its own sake and get happy about it, but rather that there are lots and lots of actions and activities that are leading to ways that we can survive well together, meaning with each other and with our non-human others as well. Like, and we need to know what they are and how to do it. Then what are the dynamics of that survival, and what do they add up to? And you know, we need science around that, and we need research, and we need tons and tons of papers and international bodies telling us how to live well together in a rapidly changing world.
Very good. I want to open it up to the group and go ahead, Judy.
I'm obviously not a student. I don't know if there's any student who wants to come first. I wanted to talk a little bit about invasive species and climate change. We recently did a study of New Jersey salt marshes in relation to sea level rise. And they basically are not keeping up with sea level rise. I suspect that's true in Massachusetts as well. Most of the Mid-Atlantic and New England, they are not keeping up. However, marshes that are keeping up are ones that have Phragmites australis, invasive species, evil thing, right? This is a plant that is, in fact, an invasive species. Nevertheless, it is enabling marshes to rise up faster. This has been known for over 20 years already. It is also absorbs more carbon than native species. My colleague Karina over there has worked on that. So it is absorbing other pollutants more effectively, more nitrogen, so there's less eutrophication, et cetera, et cetera. So we are thinking that we should change the way management of Phragmites is done. I'm not saying leave it all there, but there is a group of us that are thinking that the management needs to change. And when we speak to the managers, they do not listen. One who was very frank talking to me, because he's a former student, said, I get paid to kill Phragmites. I don't get killed to leave any of it alone. And the fact is they kill it by spraying glyphosate, which is one of the worst herbicides around. So I think we need to have, you talk about connections between the scientists and the managers. I don't see that working yet with Phragmites. We have had attempts, and we get nowhere. So I'm not sure this is a question, but it's
I can turn it into an answer.
Venting my frustrations.
Okay, there's a lot there. I'll try to be quick. Thank you. Okay. First of all, right, invasive species are not all non-natives. It's just a small percentage of non-natives that we've defined as having problematic impact, and so there's ways to redefine some of those species. So in general, we want to remember that there are non-natives on the landscape that are just fine, and they're part of our ecosystem. You know, we could argue that most of us are included in that. So, two, I think managers are already making decisions to act and to prioritize and to do triage all the time. It's just not necessarily like explicit and apparent. So there's all kinds of places where there are invasives that are not being treated because there's just not enough resources to do it, including Phragmites. And so what I think would benefit our management colleagues, including as well as us from the research perspective, is to make more explicit when we're making the decision to leave it be versus when we're actually deciding to treat something. And again, it comes back to prioritization, something you mentioned, something I mentioned. We have to think about prioritizing the places we want and for the benefits and objectives we have. So why are we doing these treatments? So if it's for an objective, a habitat objective, is leaving it alone a better idea? So we need to make explicit why we're doing something. And finally, I I guess, kind of push a little bit in that if we're having these conversations where they're actually two-way conversations, where we're understanding everyone's incentive structure, which is not necessarily what we want it to be, it is what it is. So that idea of like you get graded on how much you treat, not and how the habitat is in 10 years, those are different incentives. We might want it to be what's the long-term habitat implications. Those don't tend to be the incentives in management agencies. So that we can move the needle, I think, on that if we're having conversations, building relationships together so that we can see how we can help each other get to where we want to go. But thank you for bringing that point up.
Great question and great answer. Oh.
Hello. Oh, I'm too tall for this. There we go. I'm also not a student, although I was at one time. Got my degree down at Stockton. Go Ospreys. Yeah, thank you. So I'm kind of in the middle ground. I have a background in research. Now I'm on the practitioner side of things, but very science and research based. I work at a place called Duke Farms, which is which is a highly manipulated environment that we're trying to restore back to a nice forest. So what I do there is I grow plants, I grow shrubs and trees that are missing from the landscape there that have been removed from a variety of reasons, just because of the actual landscaping altered in and the overabundance of deer, etc. Oh, I also wanted to say, the common themes I heard today, which was great, is communication, communities, sharing knowledge. This is awesome, because obviously I think folks like us need to share and do this right. I guess my really vague and wide open question is if you guys could quickly touch upon the notion of assisted migration, especially as in terms of like tree species and shrub species in the Northeast.
Well, assisted migration or managed relocation is taking a species, planting it in places where it may be suitable under future climate, but is not native there, and it's an extreme form of adaptation that actually can have many non-environmental implications. Actually, the major implication is ecological, is that it may outcompete, it may become invasive in the new environment. But for restricted range endemics, species which are located in only one or two places, and I can think of one good example of Franciscan manzanita, which is a native California plant, and it was thought extinct until fairly recently. One tree was found in Golden Gate National Recreation Area. And so that area in California is experiencing increasing temperature, decreasing precipitation. And so because of its restricted range, it may be necessary to outplant it in areas where it's not native. But any managed relocation requires a very thorough assessment of the impacts to the receiving environment, plus the non-environmental issues there. Native Americans, many places are sacred or special, often because of a certain species mix or a certain cast to the landscape, and managed relocation might alter that. Anyway, colleagues and I on a managed relocation working group have produced a framework for assessing all those issues. But also keep in mind that that preventing the destruction of habitat in the existing parts of the range of a species is often less expensive and more effective than trying to recreate its habitat in a place where it's never existed. Thanks.
I'll just add very briefly that I don't know if I'm very, interested in the Duke Farms example. In the 5 boroughs of New York, we have an urban forest called Forest Park in Queens. And that's also been the study of a long-term, ecosystem forest ecology study. And I do feel like these places are giving us clues as to what species are in decline, whether it's black oak in Forest Park, and what species are out competing them. And so I do feel like that has begun to creep into at least the landscape architecture and nursery industry, where you see, if you look at the city of Chicago street tree list, it's already kind of integrating species from as far south as Tennessee and Louisiana. So I do feel like, intentionally or not, that this process, at least in the practice in some places of assisted migration, is ongoing, a live experiment, if you will.
Thank you all so much for your talks. I found them all very interesting. I have a question that kind of plays a bit off of the end of Dr. Gonzalez's talk, but it does have some applicability to other things. So of the individual solutions you were talking about, a lot of them seem to work better in urban environments and urban areas. And in general, it seems that urban areas have lower per capita carbon output. But I feel like there's this disconnect in how we communicate things. Can you hear me or no? Let me move closer. No, so a lot of like the climate solutions on an individual basis and on a larger basis seem to work better in urban areas on a per capita basis. People who live in urban areas tend to have lower carbon outputs on a per capita basis, adjusting it for economic status. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that. But I feel like there's this disconnect between understanding of the public of that, and a lot of people think like, oh, if I live in a rural area, I'm doing better for the environment. There's lots of trees around, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like we haven't, I don't see much communication on that front. Does anyone do you have any perspectives on, I feel like to me it's very loud if I'm really close. Anyway, so is there any perspective on how we could communicate the actual impacts of urbanization on both biodiversity and climate change? Because it obviously has a lot of impacts, but I feel like it's not very well communicated to the public. Can we hear that or no? Do I need to?
I just have a very quick response that, the density in the urban environment is key to kind of resist what landscape fragmentation by roads and other infrastructure. So I don't know, I agree, I'm not sure if there's been this kind of larger scale communication on that front. One thing is clear to me, in addition, we've been talking about climate solutions, is that solutions have to be much broader and at larger scales relative to, depaving and or consolidating managed retreat and kind of bringing communities to live closer together to enable larger patches of contiguous landscapes. But maybe that is a big communications challenge for the future, because for right now, the solutions sometimes seem to be a little bit more based on the scale of an individual or a piece of legislation, maybe less so targeted towards bigger, broader built environment and behavioral challenges.
I guess I'll just quickly add, I really appreciate you bringing up that point, and that's where even if you're not, research ecologists in the room, we need the people to go into planning and some of these other fields that feel separate, but are actually going to solve some of these problems maybe better than some of us up here on this platform. So we need people thinking about these things from all different fields.
Do we have an online question or? No, no one online. Okay, one more question. Yeah, we'll make this the last question.
Thank you very much for your talks. You managed to settle us with anxiety, with all this global ecological collapse, and then give us this light, a little bit of hope. It's a very powerful message. Thank you very much. And I think this should be disseminated more, this approach that it's actually very scary, but there is hope. My question actually is like more general, is even though we had pandemic, we have all the digital platforms, why till today is the best way of communication is person to person? Why is this so till today with all the resources we have? Thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a great question. Yes, I am a social scientist, but I don't study communication per se. I have worked a lot, as many of us have, whether social scientists or not, face-to-face with people, as it were, and that can be very effective in terms of creating, change or creating new ideas and so on. I think it has a lot to do with the sort of the embodiment of what we do know and what we feel, that it's in our bodies, and having them proximate to each other makes a big difference in terms of what we may feel, do, or know. Having said that, I think too, though, that there's a lot, my interest in sort of data and categories and classifications and so on also sort of constitutes possibilities for change and for the world. And I think, so both have to go together, I guess, is what I often advocate and try to teach is, the snazzy graphs are fabulous and I love them and I love the quantitative approach and what it can do, but I also want to bring that data to a workshop with people on the ground and see what difference it makes face to face. Yeah.
I'll go. Thanks. I appreciate that question a lot. And I think there's, on the one hand, there's no substitute that from, being able to drink coffee or go have a beer and talk and, and sort of spitball ideas. And I think the ability to be able to sort of point to something and say, hey, we're like, what's going on with that species right there? And then everyone can go look at it. Those are some of those illustrate some of those intangible things that happen when you're with someone right there. But I will say, I know at this point, 2-3 years later, we're all sick of Zoom, but there are ways to connect with people through these digital platforms that now we're all used to Zoom. So we've got people Zooming in here, and I think for me, the pandemic illustrated that there is value in those sorts of ways to communicate. Our lab was sad and lonely that we didn't get to go to any meetings over the last couple of years. So in 2021, we organized an online workshop. We just put out an invitation in Spanish to collect, colleagues from basically Massachusetts all the way down to Brazil to have a, just an informal symposium. We called it a pop-up symposium on tropical dry forests. We got over 100 people participating, and we made lots and lots of connections from that. So I think that would it have been better to have everyone all together? Sure, but it was also free, and we really got to pull in a lot of people, students, voices, people who wouldn't have been able to participate in any other way. So for me, that was it was a big eye-opener. People want to connect, and we can actually lower the bar for many people being able to participate in events, through these kinds of digital platforms, I guess I would say.
The evolution of effective communication remotely and the mix of in-person and remote communication is very promising. It encourages me a lot. People in Western countries that have a fast internet, we're now becoming more judicious in the use of travel for what ends up to be extraneous and non-necessary purposes, and that has a real climate change impact. And so we're being more judicious now, and so this development of innovative ways to mix in-person and remote participation is very encouraging. I'll remind you that much of the world does not have fast internet connection, and so actually something that's very old-fashioned is just talking on the telephone, and sometimes that is the most appropriate and effective means. I can actually call my family in a village in Senegal, in West Africa, way off the grid now because there's a cell phone tower and they have a cell phone now. It's where I served as a Peace Corps volunteer, where previously to make a telephone call you needed to hike to the road, from the village to the road, then get on a public transit, a little bus, van, and go to the capital city, stand in line at the post office, and make a telephone call. And now I can just call the village straight out, and I don't have to get on a plane and go there to share a common human experience through voice. And so oftentimes that common bond can be through voice or video, and that's a good thing.
Okay, so I want to thank you guys because it was a fantastic panel. I really appreciate all the questions and the way you handled them, and so just thrilled that you joined us today. So thank you very much. Thanks very much.